So now that we have a general understanding of the Constitution and that it's the document that's going to lay out the framework for this new government of the United States, we're now going to look at each section more closely. So we know that it's dividing up power between three different branches, right? It's separating the power between a legislative branch, a executive branch, and a judicial branch. And the Constitution's written in articles. So Article 1 is about the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is the most complicated of the branches of government. And we're going to look at how it developed, its structure, what it can and can't do. So this might actually take a couple of lessons. So Article 1 of the Constitution, quote, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, unquote. So it's laying out how the legislative branch is going to function and what it's going to look like. So the first thing we need to understand is what is Congress, what is the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the legislative branch is made up of Congress. Now, Congress is the body that makes laws. And how we got Congress is a lesson in history and in compromise. So looking at a map, we've got all of these different states. And thinking back to the Articles of the Confederation, the states had a lot of power, right? They had very strong state governments. They were very much in control of what went on in their state. With the Constitution, they're giving up some of this power for a stronger federal government. And the states are worried that in doing this, that their interests are not going to be heard in this new government. So how are the states going to be represented in this new government? You have the South, which is very agricultural and has slaves. You've got the North, who wants to trade and doesn't like slavery. So the states realize it's going to be very important to make sure that their states' needs are met and are heard in this new, stronger federal government. So they have to come up with a way for the states to be represented. And they come up with two plans, the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan is a small state plan. New Jersey is a small state with not a lot of people living in the state, and they're worried that with so few people that they might not have as a larger voice in this new government. And they don't want to get overlooked by larger states like Virginia. Virginia has a lot of people living in Virginia, and so they may get a larger voice in the government. So New Jersey comes up with this plan that says every state is going to have the exact same number of representatives. Whether you have a lot of people, whether you're a big state, whether you have few people and you're a small state, doesn't matter. Everybody gets the same number. Virginia, on the other hand, comes up with their plan, which says, no, let's base this off population. We have more people, so we should get more votes. That whole majority thing, right? So if we have the majority, we should have more votes. So we come up with a compromise. This is called the Great Compromise. It's sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise because it was proposed by Roger Sherman from Connecticut. We're real great at naming things around here. So the Great Compromise created two houses. It gave us a bicameral Congress, two-house Congress. We have the House of Representatives, which comes from the Virginia plan and is based off of population. And then we gave us the Senate, which is based off the New Jersey plan and gives every state 2 senators. Let's talk about the Senate first. So the Senate was created to give equal protection to the smaller states. So states with larger populations would always outvote states with small populations. But in this case, every state gets an equal number of representatives. Every state gets 2 senators. So if there are 50 states in the Union, we have exactly 100 senators. The Senate is sometimes called the upper house because the senators are elected for longer terms and they're supposed to be less affected by majority rule. Remember, the founders feared that mob rule thing. Senators are supposed to be looking out for the broader interests of the state and for the nation, and they're not supposed to be as close to the masses. So with 6-year terms, and 2 senators for each state, they stagger their elections. Okay, so one senator is always running for election while the other one is not. Originally, senators were not elected by the people, again, putting them a little bit further away from the masses. Each state legislator would vote for who they wanted to represent the state in the Senate. This was to keep the senators loyal to the state and looking after state interests. This was a way to check the power of the federal government. However, there was a problem. There were accusations of corruption, and senators were being bought, and bribes were getting paid for people to become senator. And of course, there was deadlock. When the state legislators were voting for people to go to Washington, they couldn't decide on who to send. So sometimes you'd have states just not able to send senators. So in Indiana, for 2 years, Indiana didn't have senators because the state couldn't decide who to send. So they passed the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment made senators elected by popular vote. So now, every 3 years, you go and you vote for a senator. So you vote for senators now, but it wasn't always that way. I do want to point out this horseshoe dot-colored image. This is going to be used throughout this course. It is to show parties and how they're elected, or what parties in power, that sort of thing. So, for example, you have So take a moment to look at the image of red and blue dots. Each dot represents a senator, so there are 50 dots. The red dots represent Republicans and blue dots represent Democrats. So in this image, we can see that the Senate is pretty evenly split between the number of Republicans and Democrats elected. But that's not always going to be the case. You might have a Republican-held Senate, meaning that there are more Republicans than Democrats. And there's always elected a House leader. The House leader is always the majority party. So in the Senate right now, there are more Republicans than Democrats. So the leader of the Senate is a Republican. That's one way that you can tell which party is in power in the Senate, based on which party has the leader of the party. The leader of the Senate or the leader of the House will be the same as the party in power. So right now it's a Republican leader. So if you wanted to be senator, could you be senator right now? Can you be senator when you turn 18? Senators must be 30 years old. You must be a citizen for 9 years. And you must be a resident of the state that you represent. So you can't run for Senate in Iowa and live in South Carolina. So some pretty basic requirements. So the other half of Congress is the House of Representatives. But before we get started, I want to clarify some terms because words get a little bit tricky. So Congress, when you say Congress, you're referring to both the House and the Senate. So you're talking about both halves together. So to pass a law, Congress must vote. The House votes and the Senate votes. Now, when I say congressman or congresswoman, I'm talking about somebody who serves in the House of Representatives. We call those congressmen and congresswomen. We call people who serve in the Senate, we call them senators. A representative can be serving in either house. We're not making a distinction. We say, oh, they're representative. We don't. That doesn't really tell me whether they serve in the House or the Senate. We don't know. Legislator is another term for somebody who, it's ambiguous. You don't know whether they serve in the House or the Senate. Okay, so make sure that you don't get confused with those terms. All right, so the House of Representatives is based on population. So larger states have more representatives than smaller states. The total number of representatives is determined by the Constitution, and that number is 435. How many representatives each state gets is determined by population. So as of 2010, when the last census was taken, this is how many congressmen or congresswomen that each state gets. So you can see that South Carolina has 7. Larger states like California, Texas, they have more. You can also see that as populations change, the number of congressmen you get changes as well. So South Carolina grew in population, so we actually gained a congressman. Where Louisiana, it shrunk in population, so they lost a congressman. Now, the number of congressmen is important because the more you have, the more votes you have. So South Carolina only has 7, so we have to work with other states if we want to get certain bills passed, right? So like we might have to work pretty closely with, let's say, Georgia or North Carolina. We have to build coalitions to get bills passed, because if Texas votes no, South Carolina doesn't have enough votes to get the bill through. So it's important. Also, the number of congressmen you have is directly related to how many electoral votes you get in an election. And we're going to talk about electoral college votes in an upcoming lesson. So just remember that for later. So if South Carolina has 7 congressmen, how are they chosen? Every state is divided up into what are called districts, with one person representing each district. So since South Carolina has 7 congressmen, South Carolina has 7 districts. So when you go to the polls to vote for your congressman, you're voting for someone to go to Washington that represents your district. Okay, yes, they represent South Carolina as a whole, but they're also very closely, it's even smaller than that, right? So looking at this map, you can see that if you live in Aiken, your representative is campaigning and trying to get votes for District 2, okay? And so the person who represents District 2 is different than the person who represents District 1, okay? So your representative is based off of districts. But how did districts get their shapes? Okay, and this is important because districts are actually created by Congress, and the party in power is going to determine those shapes. They get the job of districting or drawing those lines. And the party in power wants to create districts that ensure that that district will keep electing people from their party, right? If the Republican Party is in power, they want to keep electing Republicans. And so what they want to do is create safe districts. So they want to draw districts in 2 ways. One, they want to concentrate as many of the opposing party into as few districts as possible. Okay? So you draw it so that one party only gets 1 district. So for example, you would draw it so that you would draw your lines, you draw your district lines so that Democrats, all the Democrats are in district, let's say District 1, okay? And so that means that the only district that Democrats would get in South Carolina would be District 1. So we get 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat. Okay, so you try to concentrate it so that they get as few districts as possible. Or you can draw it so that you disperse the opposition party so that they can never gain a majority. So you curve your lines around and you put some Democrats in District 6 and some Democrats in District 7. And they do this because the party in power wants to stay in power, right? And so they're going to create districts that do this. And this is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is basically creating these weird shaped districts that ensure your party stays in power. And this cartoon from 1812 is making fun of how the districts were in Massachusetts. They had carved up and created all these really strange districts in Massachusetts that it was basically like this giant evil lizard. Gerrymandering has a very negative connotation. I mean, even though it still happens and has been happening since 1812, it's not a good thing. It definitely has negative connotations. So here are some districts that I found. So you can see, like in Illinois, District 4. Like, what the heck? Why would you make a district like that? Or North Carolina or Louisiana. Why not just take divide it into squares? No, it doesn't work that way. So looking at the map of voting districts in South Carolina, you can see that some areas that are really gerrymandered, right? Look at District 6. Why does District 6 go, basically cut District 2 in half, right? District 6, goes through the capital and then, up, I guess maybe by Lake Murray, maybe? I don't know. Goes up, carves out that. Or look at District 1. It's not just the coast. They've got this weird little shape that goes into District 6. So a lesson or a question in the lesson is going to ask you to find your congressman or congresswoman. You have to do it by zip code because a lot of times you could live on one side of the road and be in one district and on another side of the road be in another. So make sure that you tell me when you're looking up your congressman, you tell me your district and your zip code so that I can look it up. Another thing is the way it works for national politics, this is how we're talking about sending representatives to Washington, right? It works the exact same way at the state level. So when you are voting for your state house member, we're divided up into districts the same way, except there's something like 90-something districts for state level. So this is a state map. So don't get your state representative and your federal representatives confused. They're two different people, two different elections, but they're determined the same way. So if you wanted to be elected to the House of Representatives, you would need to be 25 years old. I could run, just saying. You have to be a citizen for 7 years. You have to live in the state or she represents. Another thing about the legislative branch in the House and the Senate is that there's no term limits like president. So the president, he can serve 4 years, run for re-election, win, serve another 4 years, and then he's done, right? 8 years and it's over. Not so much for Congress. You can serve as long as you are alive. Very notoriously, for example, in South Carolina, Senator Strom Thurmond served 48 years in the Senate. He was 100 years old. It was like a running joke. It used to be said that he would be propped up, and he wasn't really doing anything. He was 100 years old. His aides were working for him. So why did he keep getting reelected? Okay. And it's something called the incumbency advantage. Now, an open seat is when there's nobody running for re-election. So if somebody dies or they decide not to run, there's an open seat. But most of the time, if you get elected, if you're in office, you're going to run for re-election. And if you run for re-election, you have something called the incumbency advantage. And that is the person who is elected is likely to be re-elected. In the House of Representatives, there was a 99% chance that if you were running for re-election, you would be re-elected. And that is for several reasons. First, money. It is so expensive to run a campaign. You have to get people that believe in you, and you have to get your name out, and you have to let people know who you are, and that's expensive. But if you are already elected, you've already done that, right? People already know who you are. You've already done the groundwork. And it's easier to get people to give you money to run a re-election campaign because they already know who you are. You're not just Joe Blow running for office. So it makes money easier. It makes name recognition easier, so you don't have to do as much even if you do have more money. You have a voting record. You have been in office and you have done things, and people know what you are, and they don't like change, right? They know that you're going to vote a certain way, and they don't know what Joe Blow is going to vote like. So that's also a reason to re-elect somebody. Seniority. The longer that you serve, the more seniority you get, and the way Congress works is they have committees, and these committees work on different bills, and we'll look at that in a later lesson. But the more seniority you have, the more prestigious and the more important committees you get put on. So if you are a freshman congressman, you're not going to get put on the Homeland Security Committee. You're not going to get put on the Appropriations Committee, where money goes. You're going to get put on something like agriculture, right? Or ethics is pretty big right now. But there's different committees, and those committees are based on seniority. So people want to elect people so that they can get on committees based on seniority. So the incumbency advantage ensures that whoever is elected is probably going to be re-elected. And that's how you end up with people like Strom Thurmond, who served for 48 years, and even though they're 100 and barely making it to the office, we still re-elect them. All right, so powers of Congress. What does Congress actually do? We know how it's made up, we know its history, but what does it actually do? It makes laws, and we're going to look at that in more detail later. But Congress is also the one that declares war, right? The president, the executive branch, does not declare war. Congress does. Congress is the one that raises an army. Congress is the one that coins money. They regulate commerce. They're in control of the budget, right? They hold the purse strings. The Congress does. The Congress also establishes rules on laws and immigration, and it establishes federal courts. Now, there are differences between the House and the Senate on what things get started where and things like that. The big differences are that bills that involve taxes and revenue have to start in the House. Why? Because the House was supposed to be connected to the people, right? And we don't want to go taxing the people because we know what can happen, American Revolution. We want it to start as close to the people as possible. So those bills have to be started in the House, okay? The Senate is solely responsible for approving treaties, especially with foreign countries. Remember that snobbish, we're just a little bit better. We like to leave that to the Senate in dealing with overseas. It also approves presidential appointments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about checks and balances. Impeachment. Okay, we all know that impeachment is the process of removing a president. Now that is left to Congress, but it's divided into stages. The House starts the proceedings, right? The House is the one that says, "Oh, Mr. Nixon, I think we're going to impeach you. We're going to start it." But they don't actually hold the proceedings. The proceedings are actually held and ruled over by the Senate. So obviously, for one reason, there's 100 senators versus 435 House members. It seems a little bit more controlled if you have the Senate trying it. So we will look more in depth at Congress and how it does all these things in the next lesson.